Welcome back to the Whispering GM. New episode, Ghouls Just Want to Have Fun and Paralyze People. This is the response episode to 2 episodes ago where I asserted that ghouls are not as dangerous as they may seem based on the nature of how they can or cannot affect multi-hit die creatures. But before we get into that too much, I had promised in that episode to tell you about Wight Box. It's up to version 1.3. He's updated it. Good on him. I will link to the PDF in the show note. But what did the basic expert interpret in reading through chainmail ghouls versus the fighting capability of fighting men or wizards? Doesn't matter.
Hey, Riley here. Great episode on ghouls. It's nice to look back and see how they were perhaps meant to work by just looking at the 3 Little Brown Books and chainmail. Heroes or non-normal types, being able to be immune, I think is pretty good. It kind of sucks to lose a character to paralysis and being eaten by ghouls.
Indeed, it does. But fortunately or unfortunately, it is part of the game and part of the genre. One of the reasons that I think ghouls being unable to paralyze heroic figures or supernormal figures, it fits the fiction. When you are dealing with ghoul paralysis, it depends on what you perceive it to be. If it's the hammer horror freezing in terror, the deer in the headlights effect, it makes sense for that to affect the helpless 0 level or 1st level human, but the hero, Van Helsing, or whomever, they see through it. They move against it, having experienced it or having fought worse. It's outside of their paradigm. So the ghoul is an adversary intended for a specific genre of play, and that genre of play enforces the low-level tone. So once you get to Conan tier, Conan's not going to be paralyzed by the ghoul anymore. He's going to overcome this necrotic energy. He's going to respond with feral instincts against the fear. By comparison to, your workaday character who's fresh off the farm. So I guess where I was going with that, it fits the fiction. If your low-level characters are fighting low-level dangers, then your high-level characters are supposed to be fighting heroic things. It's not very heroic to paralyze with fear.
On traps as monsters, sure, I think you could go that way and use AC to defend against these physical traps, an arrow trap or a spear trap that seems kind of similar to a monster with a bow or a spear. I think the difference is, though, that when a monster's attacking you, you're actively defending. And so you're trying to get out of the way, you're holding your shield up, deflecting with your sword or, maintaining distance. Whereas a trap, you're sort of catching you off guard, right? You're walking down the hallway and you hear something snap and then a arrow is halfway across the room already at you. Can you get out of the way in time, or do you get lucky? Same with the spear trap. All of a sudden there's a spear coming for your side out the wall. Can you get it out of the way? As opposed to that active defense. Interestingly, you could turn that around to a thief backstab. Maybe that should be a save. Talk to you later.
But on the other hand, how much of AC is actually active defense? That is, I may not get out of the way of that arrow or dart shooting across the hall, but I'm much more likely to ignore that bolt if I have a steel breastplate it can bounce off of. Similarly, if that spear is coming up out of the floor, if I'm wearing metal boots, it's going to have a lot harder time incapacitating me than if I'm wearing cloth shoes. So on the get lucky side, it's a lot easier to get lucky if you have metal armor on. That's the reason why I wear eye protection when I'm doing weed whacking or edging out in the yard. It's a lot easier for rocks or whatever, sticks, whatever I hit that I don't see, to get into my eye if I'm not wearing eye protection. Alternatively, I could steal a few things and level up as a thief. Then I could do my yard work unimpeded. Food for thought, and thank you for calling in. And thank you for putting up with the month and a half, or however long it was, between when you called in and when I answered.
Hey Taylor, the Pink Phantom here. I had a few thoughts on your podcast about ghouls and are they as scary as they're made out to be. I think in at least one way they are even more scary than they're made out to be. Because regarding your question about Constitution, I think the notes on the Constitution section under bonuses and penalties to advancement due to abilities is that the notes regarding Constitution are exactly what they say they are. It's not a percent chance that's like a saving throw that lets you resist being paralyzed. It's a chance to survive when you are paralyzed. So when it says for having a 8 or 7 for Constitution, you have a 40 to 50% chance to survival, and 9 to 12, you have a 60 to 90% chance of surviving. If when you are paralyzed, you have that percent chance for essentially your heart not stopping from the paralysis and killing you instantly, which fits in with the earlier forms of D&D where there were a lot of ways to die instantly. Poison, of course, being the most prevalent, I guess. But it does raise a question that since the note for 6 or less on Constitution is -1 from each hit die for reducing your hit points, I wonder if they just didn't have the room to include that you would have a chance of survival. It'd be, if you go by the 10% per point that they're going for the rest of that stat, it would be 30% for 6, 20% for 5, 10% for 4, and if you had a 3 Constitution, you're just out of luck, you're automatically going to die. Or does that mean that if you have a 6 or less, you automatically die if you get paralyzed or petrified? But I do think this is one of those kind of rare situations in the early versions of the game where what they say is both exactly what it means and is stated straight out.
Now, I am holding my Men and Magic in my hand, and you are correct. It does, in fact, say Constitution 9 to 12, 60 to 90% chance of survival. So yeah, that makes ghouls double terrifying if being paralyzed will stop your heart. Though another thing that's in here, like you are going to go on to say, because I kind of interrupted the call, this is one long contiguous message, but it says chance of survival and withstanding adversity, but then the book does not give a condition to withstand it. Like, so in our Constitution explanation of abilities, it says Constitution will influence such things as number of hits which can be taken. That's your -1 or +1 to each hit die. How well the character withstands being paralyzed, turned to stone. So, yeah, that's interesting. So, in future editions of the game, it explicitly states that you have a chance to die coming back from resurrection. That's in AD&D. I don't believe it's in OD&D, but this could be the origin point. I remember, it's been a long time. It's been like 2 months since I released that Ghouls episode, but At the time, I remember reading this message and having a counter argument that I don't think I have anymore. Because the question would be, how early, at what point did the survive resurrection or survive petrification, when did that start? Answer may be right here.
One thing that I don't think is stated straight out, but I think it is meant to be based on what I've seen in AD&D as well, is that when they talk about men, they're also talking about what we call demi-humans. They're talking about halflings and elves and dwarves.
Also, when they talk about castings, frequently that refers to a figure casting at scale of whether it's 1 to 1, 1 to 20, what have you. But that's just a bit of trivia and immaterial to the conversation. Please continue.
So that halflings and elves are not immune to being turned into a ghoul. And I think what backs this up is on page 19. Well, pages 19 and 20, but the part I'm talking about is on page 19, where they have the attack matrices for the attacking the various armor and shield combinations that you could have. For leveled characters, it's labeled men attacking, and then if it's just for creatures who only have hit dice and don't have levels, it's monsters attacking is the matrix.
Okay, so it's not that they are men per se, but instead that they are your men. That's like dudes attacking. They're my dudes, and I can jive with that.
So this is something I've seen throughout, again, the early versions of the game, where men and human are used kind of interchangeably to mean anything you can play as a PC. And you see it again in both OD&D and AD&D with potions of human control, where you roll to figure out what type of human you're controlling. If it's a halfling, if it's a dwarf, if it's a man. And I don't think they ever really settled, at least in OD&D, is the race man or is the race human? And then I think in AD&D, it's a little more, the race is men, but human covers all the characters, all the potential races of characters that you could play as a leveled character. So I think anyone with levels has the potential, when they die, to come back as a ghoul if they're killed by a ghoul. With regards to what most of that section of your podcast was about, and your question, do essentially heroes and superheroes, or those who fight as heroes and superheroes, which, well, I'll get to that in a second. Heroes and superheroes, do they count, since they're on the fantasy combat table, they can fight on the fantasy combat table? Do they count as those not normal figures, so that they would not be susceptible to paralysis at all? And I think this raises the question that I kind of alluded to a second ago. Is it being a hero or superhero, which are titles given to the levels of the fighting men, or is it being able to fight as heroes and superheroes, which make them special?
Truthfully, I have been going on the assumption that it was the fights as in the advancement matrix, in part because that implies a cleric who doesn't have a hero or superhero title would then become ineligible for this kind of heroic role, which doesn't make sense. Clerics were the anti-undead archetype. But if you look at the cleric fights as advancement table, they fight as hero just later than a fighting man. They fight as superhero just later than a fighting man. So from the way I have read it, yes, it's the fights as and not the level title or the hit dice of the character per se.
And the reason I ask this is because another entry on the fantasy combat table is wizards, which is something that is, only magic users become wizards. And it has a note on that table for that entry that lesser types of magic users fight with lesser ability. Although it doesn't list those types specifically and tell you what the lesser is. I guess you could look at the difference between hero and superhero and kind of infer that.
Checking out chainmail, that's, I think, where the titles come in that are magic user related. It states wizards are as in the fantasy combat table, sorcerers are -1, warlocks are -2, magicians are -3, and seers are -4. Interestingly, if we look at the statistics regarding class, page 17 of the Min and Magic booklet, a level 2 magic user is called a seer, a level 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, oh goodness, 8 is a warlock. A magician, on the other hand, is only level 5, and a sorcerer is level 9. So the titles appear to have been reused between Chainmail and OD&D, but they don't follow the same order, I guess. Well, they're the same order in that sorcerer is the highest, one obvious wizard is the highest, but sorcerer is the highest of the lesser magic user, followed by warlock, followed by magician, followed by seer. However, it's not consistent. So seer is level 2, and then magician should be level 4, and then maybe warlock 6, and so, but that's not what Gary did, because of course consistency would make it too easy. But so the names and the pattern were reused, but then in the fighting capability, enchanters or level 7, I believe, magic users fight as hero -1. So that's the first time that they would get to fight on the table. Now, if you go off of the title, then magic users would then become immune to ghoul paralysis at 2nd level, which is really fast, or later on, which more is parallel with cleric. But I know you're about to go into cleric, so this kind of lends credence, I think, to the fighting capability side, in the sense that it lines up better with the expected level of being immune, so to speak. So an enchanter is going to need 50,000 XP by comparison to the hero, which is 8,000, but a seer is only 2,500. So are we saying that fighting men fall into the heroic archetype more rapidly? I would say yes. And then your magic users, they're not supposed to be the heroic archetype.
But there is no listing of the upper name level, so to speak, of clerics, which is patriarch. I had to look that up. But that could just be because when chainmail was conceived, they weren't conceiving of clerics as being separate from magic users and fighting men, and so they didn't have all that figured out, so they didn't factor into the table.
Could also be the Lord of the Rings aspect, because they had previously put out a Battle of the Five Armies game, which had gotten taken down by the Tolkien estate, and they previously had treants in there, which were obviously Tolkien, and there are no clerics in Lord of the Rings, only heroes and wizards.
But is it being a hero or superhero that puts you on that table, or is it having that fighting ability that puts you on that table? Now, it's probably the latter, because the cleric, while the wizard in OD&D has the fighting ability of wizard when it gets to the upper levels, the cleric at upper level has the fighting ability of superhero. So that's probably the case.
I agree, as evidenced by I, in response, am saying the same things you are saying later in your message. I really ought to listen to these whole things before I record responses.
But it's interesting because when you look at it that way, it could be that the clerics don't get the immunity to paralysis the way that fighting men do. But I don't think that's likely. Another thought I had is when it refers to the paralysis in that ghouls have, and race for that matter, it refers to they paralyze normal figures. Well, a normal figure is, depending on your scale, 10 to 20, essentially 0 level men. So that got me to wondering, on a chainmail battlefield, and if you used OD&D with chainmail on a OD&D battlefield where you had mass combat going on, the leveled characters would be individual figures, I believe. You and Daniel would probably know more about that than I would.
What I can tell you is that it's a challenge. I have played where a heroic or above character joins a unit. They are an individual and then they join the unit. So you effectively have 21 in that unit. That requires you to use man scale, which is rough. I think Daniel has done the same thing. And I say it's rough not because it's a bad idea, but because you're rolling so many dice and it takes forever. Man scale was the scale I used in. I don't know if I ever podcasted about this, but I at some point publicly apologized to players for putting them through a man scale chainmail battle. And in terms of other alternatives, Purple Druid had done a bit about how to handle scale, and you might treat a heroic unit as the hero surrounded by heroic bodyguards, which is sort of backed up in the way that you're going to attract followers naturally in OD&D, and those followers are going to be leveled followers. So that can abstract itself. Say I have 20 men around me, then they may fight as 4 men each on average. It all works out. On the other hand, I have also played zoom in, zoom out. So you have a unit in the vicinity of the leveled character, and you use the mass combat figure scale, which is very fast, for the non-consequential 0 level dudes, and then you zoom in and you fight a combat round in man-to-man or individual scale at the skirmish level. That is a little faster and a little more easy to follow. But then you have this sort of asynchrony. It's like, say I have 20 or 30 guys around me, and then I take 7 or 8 casualties. How is that reflected if the hero moves on? And now you have to either I throw it away or average them out. And so there's a little bit of math in there. Lastly, there is a video, I'll have to see if I can find it, where Mr. Wargaming explains AD&D mass combat and the way he rolls it. And I have not read the books to verify this, but the way he rolled it was the individual is on the table, the scale was 1 to 10, and if the 1 to 10 figure hits, they deal 10 points of damage. If the figure takes 10 points of damage, the figure is eliminated. So your one character engaging with 1 10 scale figure, if you can hit and deal 10 points of damage, you wipe out that unit on 1 hit. If you do anything else, it's as though you missed. This works better with wizards because I can see doing 10 damage or more as a wizard. You fireball, you blow the snot out of whatever you're shooting at. But as a fighter type, it's more challenging, which I guess if you had multiple attacks, you could then stack them up. So say I have 3 attacks this round, and I get to roll 3 times, and I hit 2 of them, and I roll 2d8. That's going to be average of 16, so I'm likely to take out a unit. But yeah, so there's that way as a tertiary option. Back on the subject of ghouls, I feel that's interesting because if a group of ghouls paralyzes a group of retinue, how does that affect the character?
But an individual character would be a figure versus a figure that stands for, 10 or 20 men. So is in fact a normal figure that figure that stands for 10 or 20 men, which means that all leveled characters are resistant to the paralysis of ghouls, and not just characters who have achieved sufficient level to fight on the fantasy combat table. They wouldn't be able to hurt the ghouls, but they would be resistant to their paralysis. And then the part where elves are resistant to it is referring to those 0-level units of elves. So a group of elf archers caught in combat with ghouls or wraiths would not be paralyzed when they were touched, whereas a group of human footmen or dwarven, axemen would be subject to paralysis if they were attacked by a ghoul.
It fits the fiction, I think, because think about zombie movies that you watch. There are, in the beginning, people freak out about it, people get eaten, and they make bad decisions. But then by the middle or end of the film, invariably, they're more attentive to the zombies. They avoid the groups of them. They remember to shoot for the head kind of deal. And so that kind of tracks with the experience level. Yes, ghouls are terrifying initially, but then as soon as I've got some experience under my belt, I know how to deal with it. I'm not afraid of that monster in the dark anymore. So it fits the fiction, I think. Even if you're thinking back to the zombie, and I know we're not talking about zombies, I know we're talking about ghouls, but we're talking about horror films with undead in the 1960s, or at least the pre-color epoch.
So I think those are very interesting questions that you posed, and I don't have a solid answer for you about what you asked. I think you're probably right based on, fantasy combat. So they're on the fantasy table, so they are immune to paralysis. I think that's probably the most likely answer. But I also find the idea that maybe all leveled characters are immune, and it's just the ordinary soldiers of any race that are susceptible to paralysis. But that would not keep the leveled characters from becoming ghouls if they were killed by a ghoul. So thanks for the interesting podcast, and hope to talk to you again soon.
And that would not stop those leveled characters from being eaten by said ghouls. Thank you for the encouragement. Thank you for listening. Thank you for calling in. And thank you for the feedback. In the previous call-in, Pink Phantom had made reference to sort of the insight or the commentary and what do people do. So looking, as everyone is likely aware, what is old is new again, always. And so one of the listeners at the time of release sent a link to me, and on original D&D discussion, the ODD74 Pro Boards. So again, nothing original comes out of me, because in March of 2008, a user on the OD&D Pro Board says, I've been allowing a saving throw versus ghoul paralysis, but it occurs to me this isn't stated in the rules as far as I know. Does anyone know of a reference in the 3 little books that mentions or implies a saving throw for ghoul paralysis? So, scrolling down through this thread, and of course I will link this in the show notes, user J. Rientz, which I assume is Jeff Rientz, says, my rule of thumb is anything that has a column on the saving throw chart is allowed to save, but that's the trick. There is no saving throw. And as we continue going, there's some users appear to have come to the same conclusion I did, having necroed the thread by the look of it in 2020. No save, but ghoul paralysis only affects men, so a first level fighter would be immune. Because he's not a normal man, he is a veteran, he's a hero. Further, in response to something that when I posted this on Reddit, someone had pointed out, well, touch in chainmail is coming within a certain number of inches on the table. So the ghouls would only have to show up and then disappear. So you wouldn't actually have to hit in order for the effect to take place. Now, this did come up on the Pro Boards also, saying that chainmail page 34, touch means coming within 1 inch. I don't think that applies though, because that is wraiths, not ghouls. So it's important to make a distinction because they do have different rules that were written between them. From here, I will stop paraphrasing. Again, I will put the link to this thread in the show notes so you will be able to check it out for yourself and see, because some users appear to agree with the direction I had gone, and some users agree. Some users prefer the Holmes and Moldvay approach of kind of lumping the wand save in and separating the paralysis out. In the meantime, I do apologize for not having put this episode out sooner while everything was still fresh on everybody's mind, but it is what it is. And again, if this can be argued in 2008, 2020, and then again in 2024, I'm sure that a couple months won't stop us from arguing about it again come 2030.
Hey Taylor, Daniel from Bandits, keep calling in.
Thank you for calling in. Interjecting just a little bit because this call did contain responses to a couple different subjects, which I have responded to, I have recorded, but I'm going to release subsequently in the next episode. Thought process being, we can focus on ghouls.
On the note of ghouls, because I almost forgot to comment on that. Yes, I can't remember, I was trying to look it up in Chainmail where I got it from, but I thought I had read something where if an elf or a hero touches you, the paralyzation goes away. Maybe that's in another hack of OD&D. I can't remember where that comes from.
You are remembering correctly. However, that does not apply to ghouls specifically. That is in the Wraiths or Nazgul entry, page 33 and 34 of original Chainmail. Wraiths can see in darkness, raise the morale of friendly troops as if they were heroes, blah blah blah, and paralyze any enemy man, excluding all men honed in the fantasy supplement they touch during the course of a move, not flying. Paralyzed troops remain unmoving until touched by a friendly elf, hero type, or wizard. So you are remembering page 34 of Chainmail. By contrast, on page 37 of Chainmail, wights and ghouls paralyze for one complete turn. A paralyzed figure is considered to be able to strike a blow at the wight or ghoul just prior to the paralysis taking effect, so melee can occur but only one round. This is particularly interesting if you take into account the recent conversation about how many rounds can you fight in a single turn in Chainmail. That is, there are some folks who have been playing now where reading the way 3rd edition post-melee morale works, you get up to 3 rounds of combat before morale breaks you apart. But beside that, the more notable thing is that the Nazgul, the Wraith, that paralysis is permanent. There is no end. It says literally until the elf touches you or until the hero or wizard touches you. So, Wraiths, much scarier than before. Eowyn and Pippin, much more heroic.
But I actually do the one round of paralysis. I do not do the you can attack them back, because I do it as like an area effect. I treat it as more like a frightened, if you want. Like you just kind of stand there frozen because you're scared. So for me, I do it as a area effect kind of deal where everybody rolls effectively a saving throw. If they're normal type near the ghoul, and if they fail, they can't act that round. If they succeed, they can act. And if you are a hero or an elf, you are immune.
The scene in the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings comes to mind, where Elendil and Gil-galad square off against Sauron, and there's that brief moment of hesitation, very thematic. They passed their fear checks, or were heroes, one of the two. That's also resemblant of the way fear and terror work in some of the fantasy tabletop games, like war games, with the Warhammers. That's how it works there too. So it definitely fits with OD&D and the wargaming roots.
So I do that. I definitely keep the immunity. I like where you're going with it. I think that even like going back to BX, where I think it might not actually say how long you're paralyzed by, you could just go with the one round. I think that works really well. I also like how chainmail allows you to attack first. So effectively, ghouls move up on you. You are able to use the one round of melee, but then the next turn you are frozen. So if you don't defeat the ghouls that first round, they get a free hit on you the next round. Or, to counter it, you can't move away if, that's something you'd be able to do. So I'm not, it's curious because if you are paralyzed, sorry, now I'm rambling, but let's say you're paralyzed by the ghouls and they do a bunch of damage and you fail them around, it says you should move back. Can you move back? You're paralyzed. So I wonder how you would adjudicate that. I think I would say you can't move unless you're victim to another round of attacks.
You're not moving back there. Your lunch is what you are.
Yeah, interesting. Anyways, I think you're right, though. Ghouls can be very tough at low levels. I'm not sure if you said that, but they should almost kind of be less of a threat at higher levels. And by keeping the paralysis as, whatever a lot of people use it as, I think it's 2 to 8 rounds, and everybody's affected by it, makes a ghoul way more deadly than maybe they maybe should be to something like a hero. So I definitely like what you're talking about there. I like it a lot. It's kind of what I do. It's funny that I like things that I do. So there you go. Anyways, I think I covered everything. If not, I'll call back. Great episode so far. I still got about 15 minutes left. So I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for calling in, and thank you for the encouragement. It's always great to hear your voice, both for the aforementioned commentary, but also for your insight. So, lastly, I've been intentionally kind of dragging this out. I was going to intersperse more hints in the middle of the episode, which I utterly failed to do. But so finally, I do in fact have Wight Box version 1.3 open. So, being the most recent and truthfully most complete chainmail integration that I've seen for a long time, what does it have to say on the subject of ghouls? Let's see. Ghouls are undead that can paralyze characters with a fighting ability less than hero, and class-based characters or less than 4 HD for other types. Elves are immune to paralysis. Interesting. That fighting capability and hit dice he's got in there. So that sort of works, I think, because that will put your thief class, who may not fight on the hero table, or your MU, that kind of sets you apart. So ghouls become irrelevant at the 4th level if you're using the 1-to-1 hit dice. And then lastly, any humanoid slain by a ghoul will become 1. So, Pink Phantom, I think Wight Box agrees with you. Or Wight Box agrees with you. A dwarf can totally be a ghoul. And they will be biting and paralyzing your knees as your human fighter. Halfway there, so it does look like my initial, if I remember correctly, my initial assertion was that HD2 and above might be considered supernormal, but Wight Box has gone with HD4, which parallels the hero level for fighters. Makes sense for me. That's about all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and if there was some conversation that I missed that I forgot to go into, please don't hesitate to reach out. I've got another episode for other call-ins that I'm going to put out in the next week or so, hoping to get back on track. I appreciate you listening. Delve on. And that wraps up this episode of the Whispering GM podcast, a product of Clericware Ringmail and an independently operated production for educational and informative purposes, released under the Totally Steal This license. Some sound effects are retrieved from Pixabay, made available under the Creative Commons 0. Others are retrieved from Mixkit.co and used under the Mixkit.co royalty-free music license. Theme music is Dirty Blues, composed by Michael Ramir C., retrieved from Mixkit.co and also included under the Mixkit.co royalty-free music license. Parties interested in or with questions regarding the podcast are encouraged to reach out via the methods provided on the Clerics Wear Ringmail blog. Thank you for listening, and delve on.